So today we are going to start looking at the cell, which is the basic unit of life. I remember we've been talking about SDF, structure determines function. So we had to talk about atoms first, and that the parts of the atoms, the structure determines the job of the atom. So depending on your address on the periodic table, you had a certain job. So if your address was 7, that meant you had 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and 7 electrons. You were nitrogen, so you had a certain job. And then based on how atoms and elements come together, you get compounds. And we talked about the most important compounds in the body: carbs, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So now you understand the chemicals and why the chemicals are important. We can start talking about the cell, which is by definition the smallest living thing. So you have to understand there's different kinds of cells in nature. Cells have different shapes. So for example, nerve cells look like kites. So they're going to have a different job than a muscle cell that looks like a straw, which has a different job than a stomach cell, which is a circle. So structure can determine function. So the shape of the cell can determine the job that it does, as well as the chemicals on the inside of the cell. But you have to understand the different kinds of cells and how they work. So that's what we're going to start looking at in this unit. Now, there are some people, so like I said, the cell is the smallest unit considered to be living. What you're looking at here are some cheek cells. And so, in the case of the cell, a few people that you need to know. The first guy here is Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke is credited for naming the cell. And he was a botanist, and you know that botanists study plants, and he was looking at cork underneath a microscope. And he was actually working in a monastery, and when he looked at the cork underneath the microscope, he noticed all these little squares. Now they were hollow, because cork is dead material, so it's not going to have any of the parts of the cell still living. But he noticed they looked like these little squares, and it reminded him of the rooms in the monastery where he was staying. And the rooms in the monastery are called cells. So that's where cells got their name from. But the cells that he was looking at were dead. But he's the gentleman we give credit for naming the cells. And keep in mind, people probably looked at these cells, many times before he did. But we have to go with written documentation. So he's the first gentleman that we find dated, written information where he's talking about these things that he saw. Likewise, there's Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Based on his works, written, dated information, we give him credit with being one of the first people to view living organisms with a microscope. Now notice his microscope looks nothing like our microscopes. It was classified as a simple microscope. It had a lens. It was just basically a glorified magnifying glass. But in the 1600s, that's a pretty big deal. And Mr. Leeuwenhoek is credited with studying living organisms. And basically what he did was he just went around and looked at things. So he took water samples from the pond or, a puddle. He spit into things. He would grind up leaves and get the juice from the leaves. And he would talk and write about and date all these things that he looked at, that he discovered, basically. And then later on, we had 3 gentlemen. The first one here is Schleiden. Okay? And to you and I, this is common sense. Okay? We know that plants are made of cells. But remember, back then, that was a big deal. Okay? He's the first person to basically publish the fact that all plants are made of cells. Now, by then, they had an idea what cells were. They had better microscopes. And so, to you and I, we know plants are made of cells. But somebody had to discover it. Somebody had to come up with that. And Mr. Schleiden did. Now, if you'll notice, next on your page is Schwann. And Schwann looks like a swan. And a swan is an animal. So, Mr. Schwann is the first person to say that all animals are made of cells. Okay? And again, to you and I, that's common knowledge. But remember, when you were in kindergarten, you didn't know what a cell was. You've learned it through time. Well, somebody had to come up with that, and this is the first gentleman to publish that all animals are made of cells. And then the third gentleman, Virchow, is the first gentleman to publish that all cells come from other cells. Now, always, the ultimate question is, where did the first cell come from? And later on, when we talk about evolution, I'm going to explain how we believe we have an answer to that question. Okay. But Dr. Virchow is the first person to actually publish the idea that you have to have a cell to make a cell. Okay? Things just don't spontaneously happen. And we're going to talk about this concept we call spontaneous generation later on. Well, when you take these three gentlemen's ideas, that basically everything, because remember back then you were either a plant or an animal. As far as they were concerned, those were the only two things you were. So based on their ideas, we came up with what we call the cell theory. Now the cell theory has three parts. They're in no particular order. Just make sure you are able to list the three parts of the cell theory and talk about them. But the first part, or one of the parts of the cell theory, is the idea that all organisms are made of cells. And so remember, Schleiden and Schwann came up with the idea that plants and animals were made from cells. I remember when we first started classifying things, you were either a plant or you were an animal. So basically everything was made from a cell. Now some creatures are unicellular, like this little guy right here, that's a euglena. Remember, if you're unicellular, you're just made from one cell. Okay? Other creatures are multicellular, like us. We're made from many cells. Okay? So if you're multicellular, you can have tissues, organs, and organ systems. Because a tissue is a group of cells that work together. Oh, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Because, again, things that are unicellular, just one cell. So for example, a bacteria. And we're multicellular, we're made up of lots of different cells. So like, those are red blood cells, we have stomach cells, things like that. Now, unicellular organisms do not have all the levels of organization that we have. So the cell is considered to be the basic unit of life. So if you're unicellular, you're just one cell. But when you have a bunch of cells that work together, that gives you a tissue. And in our bodies, for example, there's only 4 kinds of tissues. So if you are a membrane, you're what's called epithelial tissue. If you're a tissue made for movement, you're muscle tissue. If you're a tissue made for communication, you're nervous tissue. And then all the leftovers, the hodgepodge, is something called connective tissue. But tissues are groups of cells that work together. Now, when you have a group of tissues working together, that makes up an organ. So for example, the heart. The heart has muscle tissue in it. The heart has nervous tissue in it. The heart has a membrane around it. Okay, that's something called epithelial tissue. And the heart has blood in it, and that's what we call connective tissue. So when you have a bunch of tissues working together, you have an organ. When you have a bunch of organs working together, that gives you an organ system. So for example, the cardiovascular system. That's the heart and all the blood vessels in your body. Or your nervous system. That's the brain and all the nerves in your body. And if you're large enough and advanced enough to have organ systems, you fall into this category we call an organism. Now, even unicellular creatures can be organisms, okay? Like protist, euglena, amoeba, different types of algae. Okay? We still call them organisms. But by definition, an organism are groups of organ systems that are working together. And then last but not least, all cells come from other cells. So once we get through cells and how cells work and why you have different kinds of cells, we're going to go over what we call mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis is how you clone your body cells. So basically, for example, you have to make 50,000 skin cells every day because you lose skin cells, they fall off your body. So you're simply making copies of skin cells you already have. That's going to be something called mitosis. Meiosis is where you make egg and sperm. But in both cases, you're making new cells. And again, the question is, where did the first cell come from? And we'll argue that when we get to evolution. Now, in the case of your cells, there are 2 basic types of cells. We have what we call prokaryotes, and we have what we call eukaryotes. Anytime you see the root word kary, K-A-R-Y, that's talking about a nucleus. Now, I call the nucleus a safety deposit box, or a safe. You put valuables inside of your safe to keep them protected. Well, the most valuable thing your cell has inside of you is DNA. DNA is a cookbook that has been in your family for generations. And that cookbook holds every recipe you'll ever need. Well, those are your genes. Genes are recipes. And genes tell your body how to make proteins. And proteins control your cells. So, You know, you might have a cookbook and you only make recipes that are in the pastry section. So you're going to be a bakery. Or you might make the recipes that are only in a meat section. So you're a certain kind of restaurant. Well, depending on what recipes the cell makes, the cell is going to make different proteins. So the cell is going to do different jobs. So, for example, your stomach cells make one kind of protein, and that protein says, hey, you're going to help digest food. While your nerve cells make another protein that say, hey, you're going to make electricity. So the DNA of that cookbook is really important to protect. So that's what a nucleus does. A nucleus is a safe that we have to protect our DNA. Well, not all cells have a nucleus. And so that's how we divide them up into our two basic cell types. The first one here is called a prokaryote. Pro means no. So this means before the nucleus. Pro means before, kary means nucleus. So these cells in evolution came before the nucleus was ever made. Pro means no. So these guys have no nucleus. So this is why bacteria can mutate so fast. Because a mutation is when you mess with a recipe. And so if you don't have anything to protect your DNA, it's easy to get in there and mess it up. So prokaryotes, pro means no. They have no nucleus at all. They're also simple. And what we mean by that is they don't have a lot of parts. When you've probably heard of mitochondria, Golgi bodies, endoplasmic reticulum. If you haven't, you're going to. They don't have a lot of parts inside of them. Okay? It would be like a bicycle. Bicycle doesn't have an engine. It doesn't have all these parts that a motorcycle would have. So that's what we mean when we say something simple. It doesn't have a lot of parts. Prokaryotes are also always unicellular. Okay? Now, they do have DNA, but they just have one piece of DNA. And it's in a circle. And so you're going to hear me talk about a plasmid. So write plasmid down, Plasmid. A lot of times the DNA of a bacteria is called a plasmid. So if you find a cell that has one piece of DNA in a circle with no nucleus, we automatically call you a bacteria. Bacteria are the only creatures in nature that do not have a nucleus. So all bacteria are prokaryotes. Everything else in nature, plants, animals, fungi, algae, protists, these guys are all what we call eukaryotes. Notice I didn't say viruses. Viruses are not considered living, so viruses aren't prokaryotes. Viruses are not eukaryotes. We'll talk about viruses more later. But pro means no. So prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. Eu means do. These guys do have a nucleus. And 99% of creatures in nature are eukaryotes. So they're complex. What we mean by that is they've got a lot of pieces inside of them. So when we talk about the parts of the cell, the Golgi body, the mitochondria, the nucleus, ribosomes, things like that, they have these parts. So that's what we mean when we say they're complex. So this would be like a motorcycle. Bacteria would be like a bicycle, not a lot of parts. Eukaryotes would be like a motorcycle. They do have a lot of parts, and those parts have to work together. Most eukaryotes are multicellular, not all of them. There are some unicellular algae. There are some unicellular fungus, which you know of as yeast, but most eukaryotes are multicellular. We do have a nucleus. That nucleus protects our DNA, and we have lots of pieces of DNA. And our DNA looks like spaghetti strings. And we're complex, so we have all of these organelles. So basically, any cell that's not a bacteria is eukaryotes. So pro means no. They have no nucleus. Eu means do. We do have a nucleus, and the nucleus is there to protect our DNA. Okay. So on your page, you have pictures. And you have what is labeled cell A and cell B. And what it's looking at are bacteria cells and an animal cell. So prokaryote, underneath that is this cell here. That represents a bacteria. And eukaryote, underneath that, you have this picture here. That represents an animal cell. So we need to label a few things on them. The first line you have there is actually pointing to the space in between all those dots. So this line right here, I want you to label it as the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is CYTOPLASM, the cytoplasm. This line here is pointing to the DNA. Notice I didn't say nucleus, it's the DNA. And this line down here is pointing to those polka dots. Notice there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of polka dots in that picture. Anytime you see polka dots, those represent something called a ribosome. Ribosome is rib-o-zome. R-I-B-O-S-O-M-E. So this is a prokaryote cell. This is a bacteria. You can see it has one piece of DNA. It's a circle. It doesn't have a lot of parts in it. It's got a lot of polka dots. And those polka dots are things called ribosomes. And ribosomes make proteins. Now, this is an animal cell. The first line there is representing the nucleus. The second line there is representing the cell membrane. This guy has a cell membrane too, just so you'll know. The third line there represents the DNA. The fourth line is pointing to the polka dot, which is the ribosome. And the last line there is pointing to something called the mitochondria. Mito, M-I-T-O, and then chondria, C-H-O-N-D-R-I-A. Now, in order to be called a cell, you have to have certain parts. So no matter if you're a prokaryote or a eukaryote, all cells have a cell membrane. This is why viruses can't be called cells. They don't have a cell membrane. They have a shell. So all cells have a cell membrane. Also, all cells have something called a ribosome. You labeled ribosome here, you labeled ribosome there. They are the polka dots. Ribosomes make proteins, and proteins are what makes the cell the cell. So like when you get strep throat, strep is a kind of bacteria. Well, it acts the way it acts because of the proteins it makes. Anthrax is a different kind of bacteria. It makes different proteins. Well, your stomach cells act like they do because of the proteins they make. Your brain cells act differently because they make different proteins. That's what we mean when we say cells are specialized. They make certain proteins, and those proteins tell them to do a certain job. So all cells have a cell membrane, and all cells have ribosomes. Also, all cells have DNA in them, because DNA is the cookbook that the cell needs so it knows what recipes it's supposed to make. Remember, the recipes are your genes, and they tell you how to make proteins. And then also, all cells have cytoplasm. Your cells are not hollow. They have this thick goo that we call cytoplasm that's going to help hold everything in place.